I'm going to begin with reading a quote from Mother Teresa, St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And it's a quote from a letter that she wrote to her own sisters, the missionaries of charity. She writes these words to her sisters, and I'll read this quote. It was in 1993. She says these words: "I worry some of you still have not really met Jesus, one-to-one, you and Jesus alone. We may spend time in chapel, but have you seen with the eyes of your soul how he looks at you with love? Do you really know the living Jesus, not from books, but from being with him in your heart? Ask for the grace. He is longing to give it. Until you can hear Jesus in the silence of your own heart, you will not be able to hear him saying, 'I thirst,' in the hearts of the poor." End quote. I love those words, and it was very pertinent for me, especially that, she's referencing books, and I've been spending the last 6 weeks in studies and books, and it's striking that, Mother Teresa is saying these words to her own sisters, that people who are already consecrated women who have given their lives to God in prayer and inspiring and amazing works through serving and giving to the poor. Despite all the amazing works that they did, Mother Teresa was worried that some of her sisters had not really encountered Jesus. They were working for him, but they didn't really know him. They were just praying to him. They were doing the works of God without God. Her message was that unless we learn to cultivate a living relationship with our Lord Jesus Christ, then even great works of mercy will fall flat. Mother Teresa will also say to another person, to a priest, she would say, without God, we are too poor to help the poor. Last week and over the next few weeks, we're going to look at John chapter 6 of Jesus' famous Bread of Life discourse, where Jesus teaches about the Eucharist and the Mass. So I thought I'd take a step back a little bit and ask ourselves and invite us to reflect on each and every one of us and ask how we approach Mass and how we prepare ourselves to enter into the sacred liturgy. How prepared are our hearts when we come to Mass? And yes, we may know and have faith in Jesus, in his presence in the Eucharist, but have we given ourselves the space, especially in our hearts, to actually receive the grace and love that he gives us each time we come before him at the altar? I'm the first one to put my hand up and confess that often I find myself saying prayers without feeling that I've actually prayed. And one mystic would say that, sometimes saying prayers can be an obstacle to prayer. Saying prayers can be an obstacle to prayer because, of course, we need to say our prayers, but often if we don't have the proper disposition or the right foundations when we enter into prayer, then we can easily just enter into prayer just rattling off meaningless words without any substance or intentionality, and ultimately without any sort of relationship. And for those of you, you've done postgraduate studies. One of the things that they require when you apply for graduate studies is that you need certain prerequisites in order to get in. So whether it's you need certain requirements, academic requirements, languages, or whatever it is, a prior degree. There is something that is required of us beforehand before something else can take place. And it led me to reflect this week regarding a spiritual life and our own prayer. What are the prerequisites in us that allow us to have a flourishing prayer life? And herein, I guess, lies the problem in our culture today. The very prerequisites that allow for a spiritual and healthy prayer life is lost. And that is, before we have a spiritual life, is that we first need an interior life, a sense of interiority. In a world full of busyness and distraction, acceleration, we lack today the basic human prerequisites for a consistent prayer life. Things like interior quiet and solitude, silence, recollection, and rest. Our circumstances in life have made the life of prayer practically impossible for us to enact and live out. One commentator said, we currently live in a dictatorship of noise, an endless barrage of sounds and noises and distractions, all sorts of notifications, where we've produced this epidemic of shallowness and we've sacrificed interior depth for the sake of busyness and hyperproductivity. To cultivate interior depth, it requires time, it requires patience and recollection. Ultimately, interior depth requires silence. Before we have a spiritual life, we need, on a human level, to cultivate an interior life, a capacity for quiet and recollection. In the 1600s, there was a renowned philosopher and mathematician. His name was Blaise Pascal. And he said these words, which have always stuck with me. He said, "All humanity's problems, the sole cause of man's unhappiness, stem from a man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." Our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. It's a very astonishing observation, and he's saying this hundreds of years ago, before the advent of Netflix or social media and all sorts of technological devices that distract us. He's saying even then, we all find a way to distract ourselves from having that interior quiet, to sit quietly and to listen to what's going in each of us. There was this large survey that was done in the US, and it was the basic question. And the question was, what did you do in the past 24 hours in your spare time? And in that survey, 95% of people who responded said they filled that spare time with all sorts of leisurely activity, whatever it was. The same people, 83% of them, said they gave no time, absolutely no time, for any sense of quiet or rest, any sort of time to just stop, to be still, to think and to recollect and to gather their own thoughts and what they're going through at that time, to be silent. When I'm talking about silence, I'm not just referring to just having a sense of quiet, like having 0 decibels in terms of just no sound in the room, because you can be in the quietest place in the world, but still have a noisy interior. I could be scrolling in my social media on my phone with no sound going on around me, but I still have a noisy heart and a noisy mind. There are all sorts of scattered things going on inside of my heart and my mind. Physical silence is important, but there is a deeper silence that is needed, and that is an interior silence, a personal silence. So as we move forward and as we continue to try to grow in our spiritual life, I have 3 recommendations as we move forward. And the first one, before we even come to Mass, we should already have developed throughout our lives a daily habit of prayer, whether it's in the mornings, you wake up and just having a time of silence before the Lord. You're not waiting until the next Sunday to have your time of prayer, but even for just a few minutes, you have a time to cultivate a sense of silence, and then you can have this time of prayer and dialogue with God. Make it a routine, like a rule of life, like brushing your teeth, something that you just commit to giving time to the Lord each and every day. The second thing is to actually practice this habit of interior silence. And like I said, it's not just turning the TV and radio off. It is this sense of actually having time to sit and recollect and think and really listen to what's going on inside of you. And many of us are very uncomfortable with this kind of silence because it can make us feel that we are not in control. We have a sense that we're being exposed. It strips us away of our comforts and our distractions. All our vulnerabilities and insecurities naturally rise to the surface when we have that time of silence. That's why one psychologist would recommend, he would say that, if you have trouble sitting quietly in your room and if that's too confronting for you, then the easy recommendation is to go outdoors into nature, because naturally that's more safer for us. We are feel much more comforted to really dwell with our own thoughts when we're sitting by the beach or outdoors in nature. We have a sense of we're not being confronted as much as if we're sitting in our room. That doesn't necessarily mean you're praying as such. Being silent doesn't equate to prayer, but it gives you the proper disposition so that when you do enter into prayer or when you come into Mass, you have already a spirit of quiet and recollection, and therefore a dialogue, a conversation, a sense of listening to the voice of God can actually take place when you do enter into prayer. Interiority is the prerequisite for a spirituality and ultimately a prayer life with God. And the third and final thing is to do your best to come to Mass without rushing, and ultimately try to come early and have this time of quiet before you enter into the sacred liturgy, lest we find ourselves entering into Mass uttering prayers without actually praying. So I thought as we end off, let us just look at the words of Mother Teresa again, as we just think about her words in terms of how we enter into the sacred liturgy and just really think about what we ought to do as we enter into the Eucharist right now. She says, until you can hear Jesus in the silence of your own heart, you will not be able to hear Jesus say, I thirst in the hearts of the poor. For without God, we are too poor to help the poor.